Taras Riley sings a song, "The System's Set to Keep the Family Out There Fighting and the Slave Masters Rejoicing, Yet We All Are One Skin." Now, we've recently seen an uptick in racist conversations on social media platforms. The Prime Minister was even asked to speak to the issue immediately after being sworn in. Now, to help us look at this phenomenon from a human resources perspective, we have Judy JOSEPH-MCSWEEN. She's a timeout specialist, emotional and conversational intelligence coach. She's the Secretary of the Center for Emotional Intelligence and Human Relations Skills. Nazeer Sultan is the Managing Director of Delta 55, consulting and training firm specializing in leadership development, transformation, and well-being. And last but no means least, HRMATT President Maxine Attong, who is an executive coach, leadership specialist. She's a speaker and author. We thank you all. Thank you, Maxine and HRMATT, for facilitating this panel and for generally being accessible. So, Maxine, I want to start with you, though, please. Before we dive in deeply, what are some of the things currently on HRMATT's agenda?
Well, DK, thanks a lot for having us here, and of course, Nazeer and Judy for supporting HRMATT as long-standing members of the organization. So right now, we're getting ready to transition new leadership into HRMATT. We were supposed to hold our AGM earlier in May, but because of COVID, we are now going to hold AGM in September. So that's one thing that's new. Other things that are immediate is that this evening at 7, we'll be hosting our final webinar series, which is entitled Leading Remote Teams. And that's the situation that most of us are in right now, where we're working from home and being asked to manage remote teams. So that's what's on our agenda. Other than that, we have just received a social media draft policy from one of our members from TSG Consulting, and we will be sending that out to our financial, let me repeat, our financial members. So that's what we're doing right now, really addressing what's going on in terms of how does an organization deal with people who are trolling on social media and all of those issues. So that's where we're at as an organization.
And I like the fact that you repeat the word financial, because many people have been saying it's one thing to tell somebody something, rap them on the knuckles. It's another thing to actually dive in the pocket and say, okay, well, this is the punitive, or this is actions that we're going to be taking. Now, Nazeer, I want to have you come in, thank you. Now, working towards inclusive behaviors, do you think it is easier to start on a micro level, or we start from a macro level?
The issue, as it is reflected today in Trinidad society, I think we need urgent work. Work is required at the individual level, the organizational level, the societal level. And we have to tackle all those with bold action. Our work in the past is not going to serve us too well. The statements, the aspirations have taken us to a place where I'll say we are in red alert. Just as you have weather forecasts, red, yellow, green, today the entire society is in red. And we need to go to a place of green, where we can access some higher levels of consciousness. We could expand our view, because if we continue to remain in red alert, we will hurt each other. The division will continue. Work has to be done at the individual, the systemic, and the societal levels.
Now, Judy, you're a timeout specialist. Is it a time or a perfect time to be taking a time out? How do we look at this from a perspective that takes a little bit of the emotion out, and we can move and we can look at it in a more objective manner?
It's a perfect time to take a time out. I think from the inception of COVID, that's what I was saying, that the world has become so busy that COVID has forced us to do what we should have been doing intentionally all along. I love Nazeer's analogy to the weather system. And I will take it a step further and align it to the neuroscience of it, in that when he talks about that red alert, it's recognizing that the country has gone through a lot of trauma because of the COVID, and then into the elections, so that our cortisol levels are really hitting their maximum. And therefore, a lot of the self-management we would be able to do under normal circumstances, that is almost through the window. So the timeout allows us to reset, to recenter ourselves, to center ourselves, so that we can deal with issues with each other with a lot more clarity, a lot more calm, a lot more internal peace.
But how do we do that with mindfulness? And I ask that because some people, it may not feel as though they are taking a timeout consciously as opposed to they've been put in timeout. So thinking the same things, having the same sort of operational as soon as they get the opportunity to go back into business. But how do we consciously take that timeout, reset, and make those internal changes?
And so you're right. Just because you've been put in timeout doesn't mean you're automatically going to go into timeout. So a good example of that was that when we locked down, people started going through their recipes, baking a set of stuff, cleaning out their homes, etc. So it's not an automatic, I've been put on timeout and I'm going to pause and I'm going to reflect. Our organizations also need to put that practice into their systems. So this is not just something that you do on a personal level. It has to be something that you do at an organizational level. So this whole thing about running to sort out the bottom line has to be balanced with a focus on relationships with the organization. For us to be our best self, organizations need to be able to balance task and relationship. And the only way they're going to be able to manage relationship effectively in order to ensure that the tasks are actually being performed at their best is if they create, as you call it, mindful organizations where we pause and create this space for people to reflect and be expressive, bring through their authentic selves so people can analyze what's really happening in relationships and determine what we need to do in order to better it.
Now, Judy, you've used the word relationships a few times, and Nazeer, I want to go to you. How do we, or what's its significance? How do we manage those relationships while trying to move from red to green?
Judy is right in saying that we have to make use of science. We have to make use of how the brain operates. As long as you are a human being, you will be biased. How, therefore, can we take the time out to recognize the bias, be it gender, be it race, be it status, and how in that recognition we give ourselves option so that we could mitigate the bias and move towards in higher order behaviors. You see, we operate, the brain is really three brains. There's the stem, there's the limbic, and then there's the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the least developed. That's the one that thinks, that's the one that said, okay, this is a better option. But before that brain kicks in, the limbic has already eaten you for lunch, dinner, supper, and breakfast. How do we create an opportunity for the green to take hold of our civility?
And we continue asking that question when we return. Now, Maxine, I took it a little easier on you in the first half, but we're getting back. Yeah, brace yourself for the second half of it. We are speaking about conversations with HR. We're discussing race. Stay with us. Welcome back. Judy, JOSEPH-MCSWEEN, Nazeer, Sultan, and Maxine Attong are helping us dive into the topic of dealing with race from a human resources perspective. Now, Maxine, we've heard a few things well, but I'm wondering, where do leaders come into play in this conversation? Is it a matter of I just allow what people are doing and then I'm forced to take action when I see people speaking about it, when I see my bottom line suffering? Where do leaders come in here?
I think, as always, for me, leaders set the tone of the organization. I believe that sometimes we're not aware that by our inaction or by our silence, we're actually setting a tone. I don't think most organizations would have a policy that states about, how we treat with equality and equity. It may be a part of some policy that exists, but nobody has ever sat down and said, okay, this is the way that we are going to treat people going forward. I think everybody does that in terms of their core values, and we know how those do or do not work. So I think that at this point in time, we need to have some more explicit demonstration from leadership, especially in terms of saying this is not acceptable. We have seen on social media that people are all over the place with this racial tension. I know I love what Judy and Nazeer were saying before, because it seems that a lot of people have been triggered and their amygdala is running wild. And that little piece of our brain that really is a very ancient part of our brain, which suggests that when we're threatened, we either fight or take flight. And right now, a lot of people are fighting in this arena around some very old and incorrect narratives.
So there's some of the things we've looked at, say, having the carrot or the stick in terms of making people do right, as opposed to encouraging or inspiring people to do right. What about taking the conversation forward? Because what I've seen someone suggesting is that restorative justice can also be something taken into consideration, as opposed to saying, we're sorry, or as opposed to saying, okay, we've parted ways with this employee, which in one case would be a little harder where the employee was a family member. But how do we say, okay, well, we're going to do something and we're going to pick a cause to try to take this forward, to not just say we're sorry, but to show and walk that walk.
So one of the suggestions that I thought about would be in terms of, we have all these ethnic holidays, yet we could see by what was going on social media, there's a lack of information. In fact, a lack of historical, factual, clear data. And so instead of dressing up for an ethnic holiday, why don't we use those holidays in organizations to share the real story of how people of African descent, Indian descent, how Arabs, how Chinese people, Asian people came to land on these two small islands. Because, one thing I always ask people, do you know what the cedula is? Do you know what it means? That's a real critical part of our history that explains why some people have land and why some people don't. And so we're walking around dressing in garb, we're eating all of this food, which is great, that's part of our culture. But what about the history of our culture that shaped these islands and how it still exists right now? That seems to be a total lack, it's totally lacking in the conversation. There is no fact. It's all triggered. It's all the amygdala reacting. It's, yes, as Judy was saying, it's been COVID and then elections. It's just like too much. So it's like a real pressure cooker situation where people are just erupting all over the place and it's not being backed by hard data. So I would say, let's not dress up. Let's tell the real historical stories of our island.
And Judy and Nazeer, let me bring you all into the conversation here. How do we have those conversations if it's easier for a reaction to happen after a trigger as opposed to saying, okay, well, let's open ourselves up to the opportunity to have this conversation? Case in point, I have recently started to unearth my ties that are yellow and red hued because I don't want them to be triggering or send a message. How do we get past that so we're able to have the opportunity to be able to have that conversation?
The answer is in design. The answer is in design, behavior design and system design. First, recognize you are in trigger. There is something that prompted you there. Get rid of the prompt. Make the prompt difficult. I want you to realize also that you see this word, and I'm picking back on what Maxine said. We have tolerated people in this society. This toleration is you live, I live. You get on my back, I will scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. We have to have a more noble cause. We have a shared space here. It belongs to all of us. Look at the trigger, halt it, recognize your bias, mitigate your bias. You go down the road and you hear a friend saying, hey boy, this kind of people is so-and-so. No, that ain't true. There is no factual evidence for this. It is in our hands, as Mandela said. It is in our hands. We weren't born with hate. But remember, we have bias. We have to be familiar with the seeds of bias. We have to mitigate it and create a space for something noble. And as my friend Noble Phillips said this weekend, could you watch your kids in the eyes and repeat that? And if you cannot, it has no place in this society.
I love that. And Judy, I'm asking you as well, how do we get a little more intelligent in our conversations?
So traditionally, DK, whenever we have to deal with an issue, we tend to deal with it in its simplest area, which is normally the system, the systemic part of it. Because we are challenged to have conversations with each other. Even when we go to have performance management conversations, some of us are very much challenged like that. So our focus has been traditionally on, let's look at the systems, let's look at the policies and procedures, let's look at the legislation. Now, that is going to take us so far, all right? And that, okay, I'm going to obey the laws, but know that when I have the chance, I'm going to sidetrack it. What we're really looking for is a transformation of mindset. And a transformation of mindset can only occur when we become fully present, fully self-aware as to what our actual triggers are, our thought patterns, behavior patterns, and then intentionally make choices that allow us to manage ourselves. So if you were to look at the things that have been going across social media, I wouldn't doubt that those have been thoughts that have been in people's minds for years and years and years. However, self-management, which is a part of emotional intelligence, allow them to manage self because their intent was really on building a relationship with the other. It's like sometimes you will be angry with somebody and you think, I could slap that person. But you don't slap them. Self-management allows you to control the emotion because ultimately you want to build a trusting relationship with the other. So that within our organizations, I would want to encourage programs on emotional intelligence so that people become aware of their triggers and they more intentionally manage these things until the new behaviors become a new habit. So it's not something that you have to be it becomes unconscious, my proper response, so to speak, to the trigger.
But I will say we need to be conscious about the time. So Maxine, you have the final 30 seconds.
Well, DK, I can say that I am very happy that Nazeer and Judy showed up today in full support of HRMATT. And DK, once again, thank you for having Judy Joseph-MCSWEEN, Nazeer Sultan, and Maxine Attong, the president of HRMATT, online with you today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, but there's nothing more for me to be said as opposed to thank you for joining on the behalf of the rest of the TTT crew. Thank you for joining and have a good night.